Sometimes married couples disagree. I occasionally disagree with my spouse. One disagreement we had was about to what degree and what amount of energy I should spend with my Trump supporting cousins. And using that as an indicator of how much energy is worth spending with people with whom we disagree powerfully, not only around questions of priority, but around questions of fundamental values, questions of fact. Welcome to Democracy Nerd. I am Jeff Smith. In the movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, a liberal middle-aged white couple that dealt with the shock when their daughter visited home with her black fiance, Sidney Poitier. If there were a remake of this movie for my audience, and I don't mean the Democracy Nerds, I mean an audience that I would be a part of, might not be the color of the skin that would lead to a reaction. Not necessarily would be a difference in religion or income, but in the modern day version, liberal parents would instead be shocked if she returned home with an engaged boyfriend, now fiance, who was a MAGA Trump supporter. In fact, in a 2020 YouGov survey, nearly 4 in 10 respondents from both political parties said they'd be very upset if their child married somebody from the opposing party. Now, in this discussion, I also want to be careful, and this was one of my important arguments made by my own spouse, not to just do sort of a both sides false symmetrical, there is no real truth or morality, there is only in betwixt whatever power movements have ascended at the time, and we want to get into that. But to put it simply, Americans are vilifying those with different political views, for good or for ill. How did it happen? What does this mean for democracy? To talk about this, we are joined by somebody who might know. Robert Talisse, philosophy professor at Vanderbilt in Tennessee, who's considered these topics in his book, Sustaining Democracy, What We Owe the Other Side. Professor Talisse, welcome to Democracy Nerd. And what do we owe the other side?
Jeff, thanks for having me. It's always nice to talk to people and to talk about these issues. What do we owe to the other side? Well, let's start before we get to asking the question about some particular persons on the other side. I think it's helpful to start by reminding ourselves what democracy is. We're all democracy nerds here, but even democracy nerds, I don't think take the occasion often enough to sort of think about what democracy is all about. Of course, democracy is about making political decisions, enacting laws, trying to pursue justice by means of governments and policies and things like that. It's about voting, it's campaigning, it's shaking hands and kissing babies. Democracy is all of those good things. But it's really hard to make sense of why electoral politics, voting, mass mobilization, the particular constraints within which our political advocacy takes place. It's really hard to make sense of why those features of our politics loom so large in our thinking about what democracy is, unless we think that democracy is an ideal. Democracy is an aspiration. And that aspiration explains, or is part of the explanation at least, of why we vote, why we protest, why we have the governmental institutions that we do, why our elections work in the ways that they work, why we have representation. The democratic ideal is the ideal of a community of self-governing equals. That's how you understand why we have, each of us gets one vote, why votes carry the same weight, why it's so important for us to be active participants in politics. It's because democratic citizens are partners in a shared enterprise. What's the enterprise? Self-government among equals. That is to say that qua democratic citizen, or in the office or in the standing of democratic citizen, no one gets to call the shots for everybody else. We're not politically anybody's superior or inferior or lackey or overlord. In this way, the democratic ideal is sort of inspiring, even dignifying. It's historically a pretty radical proposal. Democracy is the proposal that it's possible for us to live decently together without kings and overlords and plebes. It's the proposal that we can live together on equal standing. Now, all of that sounds, again, dignifying and encouraging and flattering even. But there's a challenge that comes with democracy. The challenge of trying to live together as equals means that we are bound as citizens to recognize our fellow citizens as our equals. That is, the ideal of a self-governing community of equals is not merely the ideal of equality before the law. It is that. But our equality also has a horizontal, not merely vertical, but horizontal aspect. You and I, Jeff, are equals as political partners in the aspiration to govern ourselves together. And what that means is that because our equality means that we each get to make up our own minds about the things that we think are worth trying to make up our minds about. We don't owe anybody deference. We're not, as equals, we're not required to kowtow to anybody else's say-so. So a self-governing community of equals is a self-governing community of people who disagree about important matters. Here's the challenge that democracy poses to us. Democratic citizenship means that being right about what justice requires doesn't entitle you to get your way. Being wrong about what justice requires doesn't mean that you have no political say. And that sometimes we have to treat those who we think are profoundly politically misguided as nonetheless our equals. And what that means is that we have to sometimes treat those who we see as profoundly misguided as not merely those who get an equal say in the political process. We have to regard them as people who are entitled to an equal say. To deny that is fundamentally to adopt an anti-democratic attitude. So if the answer is, what do we owe to the people on the other side? Nothing. That's the tyrant's attitude. That's the authoritarian's attitude. It can't be our defense of democracy. It can't be an expression of the democratic ethos to give the negative answer. What do we owe to the other side? Nothing. What you owe to the other side is to, as best you can, because it's a challenge. It's not easy. Democracy is not easy. As best you can, maintain your regard for your fellow citizens as your equals. Doesn't mean you have to like them. That doesn't mean you have to think, oh, they could be right. All it means is that you have to say they're entitled to an equal say. How's that?
So I don't think you said anything controversial. I think
Me either. Good.
I think among people who care about democracy, a feature or a bug in their thought process is a degree of ideological tolerance, is a intellectual, philosophical, political curiosity, is a feeling that can't we just all get along, is that we've got to love our neighbor and we've got to love our enemy, coming not only from, coming even from sort of Protestant political ethic, not even just recently, but for more than 100 years. I don't think that's controversial. I do wonder if it's problematic. I do wonder, I wonder about what problems it causes or fails to cause. Now, the it is a big thing, right? So I want to make sure we don't create sort of a straw horse. So before I do that, therefore what? Therefore, don't gerrymander people with whom you disagree out of existence. Therefore, don't restrict voting access. Therefore, think that therefore what? because I obviously don't put anybody into work camps because you disagree with them. Yes, tease that out a little bit.
Sure. So the kinds of suggestions that you just made seem to me not only right. I mean, therefore, expand voting access, don't restrict it. But note that the democratic ideal, as I had laid it out, gives us the fundamental building blocks for the argument for that position, right? Right? The democratic ideal is where we begin to make our political arguments. It's not the conclusion of our political arguments. The fundamental argument for expanding voting access is that's what a self-governing community of equals has to do. It has to make it easy, not so laborious, not so obstacle-filled. They have to provide a path for people to participate in the processes by which power is directed among equals. All that seems to me right. But here's the upshot that I would want to emphasize first before we get into talking about what kinds of policies and proposals democracy asks of us when we're thinking at
or
the
just human conduct
level.
Even just
well, just about, yeah, that's right. So before we even get to that, though, I think that, again, enthusiasts about democracy, I think in their enthusiasm, I count myself among them, in our enthusiasm, I think that there are certain fundamental insights that often get sort of sidestepped as obvious. But sometimes, as a philosopher, I want to suggest sometimes it's helpful to try to go and look at the fundamental assumptions and principles and commitments, because there's more there than we sometimes realize. And some of it is already problematic in ways that that are different from the problems that you just raised. So let me just suggest this, because I think that this is the deep problem of democracy. It asks of us that we take a moral stance that I think is not intuitively easy to adopt. Let me put it that way. And the moral stance is, as democratic citizens, as full participants in a self-governing community of equals, we've got two responsibilities. Maybe there are more, but there are at least these two. On the one hand, democratic citizens are responsible for the political order that they help to author. This means that as democratic citizens, it's our job to try to deploy the trifling sliver of political power that we have by way of the vote, by way of our voice, by way of our ability to form and join and direct coalitions. We're supposed to, as democratic citizens, we have the responsibility, I think it's a moral one, a moral responsibility to deploy our political power in ways that promote justice as we are best able to discern it. On the other hand, we also have a responsibility to our fellow citizens. As I was emphasizing earlier, part of the democratic ethic is that we have to regard our fellow citizens as our partners in political power, as our partners in self-government. And what that means in part is that we owe it morally to others to see them as deserving an equal say, even when we also see them as on the side of injustice. Now think about that. Democracy.
Well, that's what we're talking about. That's what we've got to think about. That's the hard part.
Democracy requires us to, at once, pursue justice, but also see at least certain of those who we can't help but think as agents of injustice as nonetheless entitled to an equal share of political power as our own. Now, when you frame it that way, democracy looks like it's a very demanding, conflicted moral proposal. I am required to see those who I think are on the wrong side of justice as nonetheless entitled to an equal share of political power. And moreover, when those who I regard as on the wrong side of justice prevail through processes that are themselves democratic, when they win at the polls, democracy requires me to judge it as illegitimate were the government not to enact their will.
Okay,
Think
so-
about that.
All right. So
Democracy-
I've been thinking about it since before we met. So and I appreciate the take. There was a big small phrase in what you said, and you said through processes that are democratic.
Good.
Before I even get to that, let me just ask a shorter question. What if the opposition isn't somebody you think is anti-justice? That's not merely the disagreement. It is in fact anti-democracy.
Well, that's a different question. What to do, or what we owe to the people who are fundamentally opposed to the very idea of a self-governing society of equals. It's just a different question from the question of what we owe to the other side. The people who are opponents of democracy as such are not on the other side because they don't reside, their views don't reside within any dissectable spectrum on which we sit, right? So the Sustaining Democracy book is not a book that is trying to address the problem of what to do with the fascists who live down the block from you. I think that as theory, when we think about democracy, when we think about the travails and the challenges of democracy, it's a mistake to think that the problems of democracy are all problems about how good democratic citizens need to treat the people who are fascists. No, the problem is that good democratic citizens need to treat other good democratic citizens as their equals, despite the fact that it's consistent with good democratic citizenship to be profoundly mistaken about what justice requires. That's the other side. The other side is the people who are invested in the idea of a self-governing society of equals, but have the wrong views about what government should be doing. You owe them something. You don't owe the fascists anything, perhaps. You owe your fellow citizens something. What is it? I think it's far more challenging to answer that question. What do I owe to the person who is not a fascist, is not an authoritarian, is not the kind of person that you were thinking about as a sort of, dyed-in-the-wool MAGA person? Forget about those guys. Our democratic thinking shouldn't start with them.
Well, wait a minute.
Start with the person who we think is wrong about capital punishment.
So on that part, for me, and is not hard, right? And I think it's a worthwhile message to say that because someone has disagreement about a really important policy issue, that nonetheless does not undermine the ability of us to have the conversation about policy issues, that we've got to fight, and then after elections, sort of still understand at some level, we're on the same team of democracy. We're on the same sort of human team. Morally, we have some obligation. Hey, folks, we still got to live together and figure out how to do that and not just be at constant odds, even at a human level. I get that. But when you said the fascist end of the block, and then you had your litany, the last thing you said, the hardcore MAGA person. Now, the hardcore MAGA person was president of the United States. And it's how the phrase came to be. The policy proposals, and I could turn it into a question, what do we do if the policy proposals are working to restrict voter access, working to invalidate electoral results, working to make it so that the U.S. Senate continues to be anti-majoritarian, the U.S. House becomes more and more anti-majoritarian, that to pass more quietly bills that preempt ability of even local majorities in cities, as we're now seeing in red states, to create statewide preemptions so that Indianapolis couldn't pass something that the state of Indiana wanted, that the state of Ohio would keep the city of Cleveland from passing something the city of Cleveland would like to pass with respect to justice issues that might fit within the category that you offered. What is owed to, and feel free to change the word from owed, what is owed to the coalition, the team, the movement, the proponents, slightly different things but overlapping, for things that are fundamentally anti-democratic? And I don't yet mean somebody who's wearing boots, holding a gun and trying to enslave somebody directly.
Right. Well, look, I think it's important to keep distinct an evaluation of the character of certain policy proposals and an evaluation of the people who advocate for those proposals. Turns out that a lot of people are really low information voters. They advocate for a lot of policies that, when you lay them out in their full anti-democratic character, they don't support them anymore. That is, the gerrymandering, the restricting voter access, all of the things that you just mentioned, when they are promoted by your fellow citizens, they don't promote them, they don't advocate for them under the descriptions you just gave. They advocate for them under the description, we've got to stop fraudulent elections. And you, Jeff, agree with that. If there are fraudulent elections, we got to stop them. So the idea that somehow there are these people who vote in line with an agenda that I think you and I agree, is not consistent with the democratic ideal, restricting voter access, creating new obstacles to political participation, expelling members of state legislative bodies like they do in my state for the positions that they take and the way they advocate for sensible gun control laws. It's like, people who advocate for the positions that you and I agree are not consistent with the democratic ideal don't advocate for those positions under the description of being opposed to democracy. They advocate for those positions precisely because they, as we see it mistakenly, think that they're what democracy requires. It's a low information problem. It's not the fascist problem.
I want to come back to that, but let me ask this. Who's the audience? As you think, either you think the genuine audience or your hope for audience for the sort of critical principles that you're sort of advocating with your book?
The audience is politically active and comparatively well-informed citizens who, in the course of their political activity, are subjected to group psychological dynamics that lead them to adopt the attitude that democracy is possible only among their co-partisans.
So back to the thing that you said. What I heard you say prior was, well, but the people, the MAGA person, and this is where it's tricky. And this is why I want to push you to get to the hard part, because I will say, and I'll answer the question from a media perspective, right? Like, what I wonder, well, no, I don't wonder. What I believe is that Fox News won't interview you, Drudge Report won't have you on, Alex Jones doesn't care anything about you have to say. The Atlantic, the New York Times, NPR would nod vigorously with passion that what you have said are among the most important principles of any system that we would call a democracy. And I would agree. And that, to me, is the hard part. The hard part is because now, imagine somebody believes two things. Imagine somebody believes, first of all, the fundamental democratic principle of I don't get everything I want. And that's sort of the point of a democracy, right? Is that there's exactly one person who agrees with me on 100% of the things, and he's wearing my trousers, right? And it's not because I don't have any trousers. The second thing that person might believe, and I think there are a growing number of people and a growing portion of me who thinks this, is that there is a movement in this country that is wielding meaningful governance authority, that is opposed to, that is doing practical, strategic, high priority things, whether it's on the header of the billboard, whether it's on the front of whether it's the first or even last line of a 30-second ad or even a Facebook or TikTok post. Set that aside for a moment, but in terms of the operational priorities, that the growing movement that is taken a political party that's had a deeply important tradition in our country and turn it into something that, I don't know, make the case it's not anti-democratic. And I don't mean big D democratic. And so what do I do if I believe two things? One, we all got to get along. And two, there's a movement that's truly dangerous. And by the way, imagine I transported that set of questions to another time and place in the world. And it doesn't have to be merely, 1932 Germany. That if, and to imagine another way, imagine two teams. One team who believes its role in the universe is to share power and ensure that that the power is shared. Not that showers have two people in them.
Sometimes.
That's up to whatever people want to do. And so one team thinks that their role in the world is to share power. The other team thinks their role in the world is to build, garner, and maintain power and wield it. Which team go win? And I think that is where we're at, that the small L liberal philosophy is at odds with the Roger Stone strategy of that's all liberal claptrap, that's all, Vanderbilt and other fancy school, wouldn't it be nice if, but in reality, we are here to wield power. We're going to wield power for our friends. We are going to punish our enemies, and we are going to erode democracy at every chance. And at this point in the movie, I don't think I'm overstating it. And so what does one do in that circumstance? It gets back to my sort of conversation with my wife, right? Which I've avoided calling an argument. It was south of an argument, but it was a disagreement. What does one do? Like operationally, then what do we do?
Well, again, I think it's important. Maybe I'm wrong about this. If we disagree on this point, let me know. So you started by talking about media outlets, companies. They are motivated by commercial interests. They're selling a message, and I don't think that the Rupert Murdochs of the world care much about what the message is. That is in itself deplorable for all kinds of reasons. I don't know that the news channels that you mentioned are committed partisans to anything. What they're committed to is a commercial enterprise. Then we talked about some particular political operatives like Roger Stone, who is a business person who is also committed to a political enterprise, who by his very admission, given the description that you gave, we're here to wield power. He's not committed to any particular political message either. He's committed to holding and helping others and getting paid to help others get power. And then third, you talked about citizens who, for one reason or another, ally themselves with the party, the institutions, the political operatives that are moving our politics in these unhealthy directions. Now, the thing it seems to me is that these are there are two at least important categories that are importantly distinct between the citizens and the political machinery. Now, you and I take it, are going to agree about the Roger Stones and the Rupert Murdochs and the institutions that they've built being fundamentally counter-democratic. That is their business model. Now, whether that entails that we are licensed to treat our fellow citizens in the same way we might treat Roger Stone, that seems to me to be an open question. And again, I don't know. I have relatives who, in fact, very close relatives who voted for Trump more than once. I don't think that our disagreement about voting access, about immigration policy, is a disagreement that's properly captured when it's described as, I'm on the side of preserving democratic norms, and they're on the side of destroying those norms. My disagreements with the people I'm thinking of are disagreements about what is the right strategy or policy, given that we're trying to preserve a common set of democratic norms. I happen to think they're mistaken about the empirical issues, about what immigration is, about what it does, what kinds of problems and challenges it proposes, and what kinds of benefits there are. Those are empirical differences. They're not out to destroy democracy. They are due to a series of what look to me like empirical errors committed to a policy that I regard as degenerative of democracy. But it's not because they're motivated by the aim to degenerate democracy. That's the problem. And as long as we, on our side of these issues, Jeff, think that the issue is properly construed as there are those who are standing up for democratic norms, and then all there is on the other side are these people who are out to destroy them. I think that's an error. Straight up.
This is helpful. So this is helpful. And it may be even, I had a professor who said, when you actually learn something is the first time you say to yourself, well, I knew that all the time. And that's operationally been very helpful to me. And so what I'm about to say, is it something I already thought or something I just learned? Because maybe it was and so now I'm going to feed back maybe operation a little bit, what I hear you saying, or at least now what I think after hearing what you've said. 2 principles. 1, love thy neighbor, honor the humanity of those with whom we disagree. Recognize that in a democracy, we're not all going to agree, and we've got to start at a baseline of allowing sometimes for however we define our side to lose. 2nd principle, and this I do want to advocate for, or at least bring to light and allow it to be considered, is nonetheless, or at the same time, or therefore even more vigorously, attack the institutions that are hurting democracy, attack the mechanisms that are making it harder to love thy neighbor, harder to honor the humanity of those we disagree, who are making it harder for people to live lives of dignity, et cetera. And I could go on. And then that could have some tactical sort of going forward recommendations, right? For instance, if we don't honor the humanity of those with whom we disagree, it makes it easier. And I like the way you put it, sort of the 2 groups, distinct the groups, is that then they can use that 3rd group, the citizenry, as the human shield to protect the operative, to protect the media organization. And if I'm spending all my time arguing and fighting with my cousins, then the pigs at the trough are doing whatever it is they do. It also means that I can sound a little, any of us can sound a little more like Franklin Roosevelt, who on his radio addresses wouldn't attack Republicans. He would attack Republican leadership, and he would go hard after Republican leadership. So again, a little bit like going after the institution and at the same time being softer on the people. There are still hard parts there. There's still hard parts there, in part because if you're as I am, an aficionado of Yochai Benkler's network propaganda, that it is not as top down. It is not as, Fox News and Roger Stone and then on down as it once was. Now the institutions, well, I guess I need to go here. Okay, full stop. So I think we might agree with what I just said. I've identified a problem. In the center out, and I don't mean political center, I mean power center, in the top down era of media and political power, in an era when the party decided to a greater degree than when Donald Trump was elected. That was sort of the critique. Does the party still decide? And the answers were either yes, no, or well, the thing you misunderstand is the party has changed. And now recognizing that it was not Donald Trump who started the MAGA fire, it was right-wing talk radio, and then et cetera, and then ultimately the internet. And by the way, if Fox News departs from the movement that butters their bread, if the Drudge Report departs from the readers that click and share, they got nothing. That they are, I'm not calling them victims, but they are trapped within the same architecture that they helped create. Right. So the idea of being sort of, the FDR idea of being mean to the leadership and nice to the voter, the Thanksgiving dinner idea of being nice to my family members, which I would like to be, and mean to Fox News and Roger Stone, breaks down, or at least has limitations, if part of the problem is we now have a thorny thicket of a movement that will create thorns regardless of the gardener.
Good. I think that's right. I think that the problem is not merely supply, it's demand side. It's a demand side problem. That is that the toxicity of politics, particularly the toxicity of partisan politics, is something that citizens, not symmetrically across all political persuasions, but large sections of citizens demand toxic politics. They like toxicity. They like to complain about toxicity. Pew Research Center study recently shows that Americans are agreed that politics has become too hostile, too acrimonious, too uncivil. They want a less toxic political environment. You ask those same people, okay, who's to blame for all the toxicity? And everybody points strictly to the other side. That is, disliking toxicity, lamenting hostility is now a way of being hostile, right? But here's some empirical, some further empirical stuff that I think is helpful in this regard. Forget for a moment, just to now get back to the FDR distinction. Forget for a moment the party leaders, the party documents, the spokespersons for the parties, both formal and informal, official and unofficial. Forget about all of that architecture for a moment. And let's just think for a second about the American electorate. These are people who are affiliated with a party. This includes people who might not be party members, but just describe themselves as Republican or Democratic voters. The electorate, so understood, is no more divided over policy issues than it was in 1990. In fact, on certain crucial policy questions, in fact, the questions that were the wedge voters' issues in the 90s, the American electorate has become less divided. So think about last time you heard a politician mention stem cells. This was a key wedge issue throughout the late 80s and 90s. Same-sex marriage, the American electorate is more liberal across the board, less divided in addition across the board over same-sex marriage. Abortion, forget for a moment about abortion politics, forget for a moment about the constitutionality of Roe v. Wade. The legal permissibility of abortion. American electorate across the board is far less divided on this than they were in 1990. So here's the puzzle. The folks that we are concerned with, the relatives, the ordinary voter, the ordinary citizen, the guy who's in the office across the way from me, who I have good reason to suspect votes for the wrong people, as far as I can tell. We are less divided over actual bread and butter policy questions than we're no more divided.
This is interesting.
But we hate each other more.
Yeah.
Animosity has escalated in a way that is not reflective of, it's not commensurate with actual disagreements about policy. Now, what, and not only has animosity escalated, but to go back to the earlier point that you made, it's also relocated. That is, growing up, my father was conservative. I should say, my father was conservative.
Is that suggesting you didn't grow up?
No, it's suggesting that he was conservative for his whole life, not only
right. Not just a brief period. Right.
Yeah, he's no longer alive. But anyway, my father was conservative. That's the was. He no longer is. My father was conservative, and you know, when I was growing up, he hated Jimmy Carter, with the passion of 1,000 suns. Never understood exactly what the dislike of Jimmy Carter was supposed to, you know, where it came from. His best friend was a guy across the street who was a Union Democrat. He didn't hate Kurt across the street. He hated the Democratic Party. He didn't hate the guy who voted for the Democratic Party. That's changed in America. Not only has partisan animosity become increasingly untethered from actual policy disagreement, not only has partisan animosity intensified in ways that are hard to reckon with, but partisan animosity has become local. It's become localized to particular others rather than those who are associated in some official capacity with a party. That's the puzzle. And not only, let me add one more thing to this, not only has animosity of this kind escalated, we like it more. We like disliking the other side. We like owning the libs. We like all of those embarrassing memes showing Trump looking like a buffoon. We love it. And we love to share with our partisan allies ways in which the other side is made to look stupid and silly and grotesque. We like all of the hostility and animosity and toxicity. These, I think, are fundamental dangers for democracy, because they're expressions of the idea that you're either on my side, which is the side that's on the side of democracy, or you're on the side of the fascist. That seems to me a fundamental expression of the idea that democracy is possible only when we all agree. That strikes me as the rejection of democracy.
So this is a helpful takeaway, that we have greater identity disagreement than ever, but we do not have more policy disagreement than ever.
Good. Yeah.
And that suggests itself some things, right? That itself suggests some things.
Right.
So staying with the go after institutions, and I want to say something about Brain Coach Brad teaser, if only teasing my own mind, so I'm more likely to remember it. Also in terms of and when I say go after institutions, I don't mean merely rhetorically. That can be an identity move, right? So I hate that. And you say that to your neighbor across the street, and they say, well, that means you hate me because my identity is tied up with who Donald Trump is. If you say you hate Trump, that means you do hate me, even if you haven't said that. So I don't just mean rhetorically. I mean dismantling them. I mean disbanding them. I mean defunding them. I mean marginalizing them. So focusing on making sure that the ground of democracy can actually bear fruit, can actually have plants that grow. The other, it seems to me, is a takeaway around institutions that would be good to grow our nonpartisan pro-democracy decision-making structures that could allow us to find the agreement areas on policy and sidestep at least a tiny bit our identity disagreement. That in fact, when you convene a citizen jury, for instance, you find remarkable areas of agreement that you wouldn't find if the first thing they did was watch a Fox News or pick your other media outlet story on the topic, right? Before the jury got lobbied. It's amazing how often people can find agreement.
Well, that sounds to me, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, please respond to that.
I was going to say, all this sounds to me right. I want to add one, I think, important additional thought.
Please.
Part of the problem I think we're now addressing, confronting, is the problem of the centering of partisan identity. Part of what's happened, part of the explanation of this puzzle, why do we hate each other so much when it looks like we don't have that much more, we don't have anything more to fight about than what was in play in 1990? Why do we hate each other so much more? As you were just saying, part of it has to do with the various social forces, let's put it that way. Surely social media, the internet, the 24/7 news cycle, the cable channels, all of these things play into this. There's no unitary explanation for what I'm about to lay out, but there are lots of little explaining factors. That our partisan identity in the United States has become our central way of locating ourselves socially. You put this in the lead in the intro to the conversation. In the United States today, disapproving attitudes towards cross-partisan marriage are more intense than disapproving attitudes towards interfaith and interracial marriages. Think about that for a second, if you haven't already done so. We'd rather see our kids marry someone who worships a false god than marry somebody who votes for the wrong guy. Now, that is to say that, by the way, your partisan identity, once you understand yourself as an affiliate or a member of a party. That is the most stable social identity people have in their lifetimes. Americans are more likely to change religions than they are to change parties once they have a party. Now think about this for a moment. What I'm suggesting is that part of the problem, and I think this is endemic to democracy. Democracy is not all sweetness and light is sort of like my mantra, right? Even when we're doing democracy properly, there are problems, there are challenges. Democracy is a conflicted proposal. It's not, it's not a utopian proposal. It's a proposal that even if you get it right, there's still real obstacles, challenges, and problems because the office of democratic citizenship is fundamentally, internally in tension. So the thought is that as a good democratic citizen, part of my job is to form coalitions with like-minded citizens so that we can promote justice in government policy and understanding in how the country is going to be run. That's part of what I'm supposed to do, is be a good active participant. And in a democracy, if you want to be an effective participant, if you want to have an effective voice, you've got to join a choir, right? You've got to work with your allies. Sounds great. The problem is that, again, group dynamical and psychological forces that we are exposed to in contexts of iterated, like-minded interactions are causally connected to intensified animosity to anybody who's perceived to be an out-group member, unwillingness to listen to opposing voices or criticisms of the in-group's position, in higher degrees of insistence on conformity within the group, and greater willingness to engage in risky behavior on behalf of the aims of the group. That is to say, nutshell, we are required as democratic citizens to join coalitions. Membership in a coalition can erode our democratic capacities. That's the fundamental challenge of democracy, it seems to me. That explains the partisan animosity intensifying, despite the fact that we don't have that much to fight over policy. It's because we've come more and more centrally to see ourselves fundamentally as party members, as political affiliates.
So I see a different puzzle.
Okay.
So the why that is the case is something I've thought a lot about. Doesn't mean I have it all figured out, but I at least have more than a cocktail party's worth of responses to it. Right. I at least have enough that I'd bore somebody before I was done saying, and some of my answers. And first I am struck by the fact that religion change. I'm going to try to keep that as part of my rhetorical lexicon. More likely to change religions than we are change political parties. By the way, to the Democratic Party operatives who are listening, that is an argument to do large-scale partisan voter registration drives and to try to get people to adopt party identification that'll help you wield power over time, not merely build cults of personality around single politicians. Or I'll say that just for a moment. But so I'm tempted to say I love that fact. I am struck by that fact. The one that, and it aligns with, it's similar to one that I got from The Big Sort, which is a lot of how I describe it, how some of the way I would solve your puzzle, or at least respond to address your puzzle, is that the book of that name, The Big Sort, identified that 1973, I think, was the year between then and now, though the book was written some years ago. We are slightly more likely to live next door to someone with a different ethnic background, but we are much, much less likely to live next door to somebody with a different political perspective, that we have sorted geographically, politically. Another driver, I would say, is the Southern strategy, that it used to be that we had, that has created a big sort, or lent itself to a big sort politically. We no longer have truly liberal Republicans and truly conservative Democrats. You have a few pro-choice Republicans left in the country, and you have Joe Manchin, who's Democrats, but that overlap is much less than it's been in previous times. So it's, we're less likely to have to have odd bedfellows in our political coalitions. And I think that is unfortunate. I think another piece of it that you addressed, at least in some part, is the capitalization, the monetization, the marketing of political ideas as economic products. That if you identify that market, you build it up. And I would say, and I do want to be careful because this has not been symmetrical. There has been, like, MSNBC exists in the world, but this really in many respects did start with the growth of those strategies in the early 1970s and the building of institutions that at their essence aren't very pro-democracy, except to the degree at that time that they at least were sort of anti-Russia and anti-communist. They have become no longer anti-Russia as long as Russia is not communist or pro-Republican. So where the center of it is, where the center of their values are could be debated. But I understand, I at least have enough thoughts about it. If you have any other drivers you want to share that I'm missing, and you haven't already said, I'm happy to it. I am still, but let me get this question out. You can take me back, but which is fine. But where I am still stuck is what the heck do we do about it? And I am still stuck. What the heck we do about it for a number of reasons. One, it gets back to where we were a little bit earlier, which is if what we do is convince people who love democracy to be less partisan. If what we do is convince people who love democracy to be a little bit nicer, if the takeaway message is, well, make sure that you respect those who you disagree, and your principle, to be clear, is much more specific than that. I don't think it should be misconstrued as that. But if nonetheless, if that, so even setting you aside, if that message reverberates, and by the way, it does, and by the way, that is part of the small L liberal sort of zeitgeist, then how is a team built that will preserve democracy and strengthen democracy? I am still stuck on, I have thoughts, but I'm still stuck on what we do about it. I'd love you to hear your thoughts about what we do about it, but feel free to take us back to pieces we're missing about the puzzle and what got us into this mess.
Okay, sure. So let me do a little bit of both and then.
Please.
So I think the part of the what we do about it question has to be, we have to add something to that question. What do we do about it, given that whatever we do, we have to retain, we have to uphold the democratic ethic? There are all kinds of things we could do about it that just would be inconsistent, right? So I'm a Deweyan in this regard, right? I think that democratic ends require democratic means for their realization. We don't advance democracy by, for just a moment, allowing ourselves to be ruthlessly partisan, ruthlessly illiberal, so that at the end, we can then restore democratic norms. I'm with Dewey on that. I think that, the partly constitutive of the ends when it comes to social action is the means that we employ to get there. So what do we do about it, given that we have to retain and uphold and sustain our commitment to democracy? That's the problem, it seems to me. That latter part seems to me to be the sharp edge of the problem. What do we do about it? I want to go back to the big sort stuff, because I think that is an essential part of the diagnostic story. And I think that, I assume we're going to agree on this too, that this is a good Deweyan insight as well, right? A problem well defined is a problem half solved, he says in his book on logic. It seems to me that getting a slightly more complete diagnostic story is prior to, philosophically, first. It's prior to thinking about what we need to do. We have to figure out what the problem is in order to fully appreciate the range of things that we might do to address it. And I'm glad you brought up the big sort, because I think that the big sort, the Bill Bishop stuff, is a really essential part of our diagnostic story. So the big sort phenomenon, as you had laid it out, is just that our social spaces, ordinary social spaces, from our neighborhoods, it's not only blue state, red state stuff, it is partly that, our neighborhoods, our districts, our occupations, our school systems, Your dentist is very likely to be liberal. Your surgeon is very likely to be conservative, for example. So it goes right down to sort of occupations have become, over the past now 40 years, right? Over the past now 40, 50 years, have become more segregated according to partisan identity. It used to be that certain of these sites of social interaction were segregated according to ethnic identity, religious identity, economic circumstance, so on and so forth. It turns out now that the main driver of the sorting of social spaces so that people in their everyday activities are more and more likely to encounter only people who are just like themselves. The main driver of that now is partisan identity. And by the way, you can see this in lots of cases. You know, just think about the difference between walking into a Starbucks and walking into a Dunkin' Donuts. Starbucks, I don't have to tell our listeners, I'm sure, Starbucks clientele skews heavily liberal. Across the country, by the way, heavily liberal, even in places that are heavily conservative, right? Even in places where you've got a Dunkin' Donuts and a Starbucks right next to each other. The clientele is heavily liberal. Dunkin' Donuts goes the other way. Clientele is heavily conservative. You could tell this by the interior of these places, by the way. What does the inside of a Starbucks look like? It's clearly selling coffee to people who value travel, who see themselves as cosmopolitans, who like the illusion of speaking a foreign language, who dream of spending an afternoon at a cafe in Paris, right? Starbucks is selling its coffee to a particular clientele that understands themselves in a particular way. Turns out that in the United States, if you're liberal, you're far more likely to have a passport. You're far more likely to travel outside the country. And so you see, oh, Starbucks is marketing its product to a particular kind of person. That particular kind of person correlates with liberal political views. Do you happen to know the now, I think, 25 years standing marketing slogan of Dunkin' Donuts?
Oh, geez, no, I don't. Although I
America runs on Dunkin'.
Oh, of course.
Now, think about that's interesting, right? That's an interesting contrast with Starbucks. America runs on Dunkin'. What are their products doing? Selling coffee and carbohydrates to people who need to stay awake, either because they're going to work or they're coming home from work. It's clearly, and their drinks don't have foreign, they might have strange names. They don't sound foreign, right? You have large, you have small, medium, extra large, right? You don't have venti and you don't have to speak a fake foreign language to order what you want at Dunkin' Donuts. Turns out that, let me put it this way. Turns out that all of the, I think, well-placed concerns about the causal connections between social media feeds, online spaces, and extremification. We know we're familiar with these echo chamber kinds of arguments from lots of philosophers who've been writing about it for a long time, Cass Sunstein and others, right? The problem with the internet is that it gives us control over, antecedent control over who we interact with, what messages we hear, and that's bad for us cognitively because it makes us more extreme. Turns out that's a really well-established psychological phenomenon. Louder and louder echoes of your own voice turn you into a more extreme advocate, actually extremify the thing that you believe. You become more strident, more doctrinal, more dogmatic, less able to hear any criticisms as well-intentioned, so on and so forth. Turns out that the big sorting stuff adds, this is why it's so crucial. However formidable, however powerful you think those online echo chambers arguments are, for cautioning us about preserving our democratic capacities in these new technological spaces. However formidable you think those are, turns out that our ordinary physical environments are structured in the same ways. That is, chance of running into somebody who voted right? The chances of going and standing next to somebody online for a cup of coffee and having a chance encounter with somebody who didn't vote for the guy you voted for are dwindling in the United States.
And if we're driven by social proof, if we're driven by sort of our mirror neurons, then we're less likely to mirror activities of anybody who counters or even moderates the way we're already seeing the world.
This is exactly right. And as we shift into our more extreme, more committed, more dogmatic selves, not only do we, again, this is just well-documented social psychological stuff, not only do we adopt more disapproving attitudes towards anybody we perceive to be in the out group, right? A non-ally, right? Whether they are or not, just that they're different from the in-group is enough for us to distrust them, to think that they are fundamentally vicious, to see them as disgusting. We also come, as we shift into our more extreme selves, we come to be more distrustful, more contemptuous of anybody who's not a member of our team. We also come to see more and more of what they do as explicable in terms of their terrible politics. Right? When was the last time you saw a bad driver on the road and looked to see what the bumper sticker said?
All right.
I know people who do this all the time. They explain bad behavior in terms of the way that, of course, the person's like that. She probably voted for Trump.
Yeah.
It's a common thing. Last point.
No, and I'm sure what the opposite is true, right? When somebody cuts us off in traffic or does something bad, that it might mildly surprise us if we found that we voted for the same legislative candidate.
Exactly. Last point on this. Not only as we surround ourselves with like-minded others do we become more contemptuous of anybody who's not like-minded. That's already a democratic problem, right? You might say in response to that, well, who cares? You know, the people who are on the other side are wrong. And if, you know, like-minded interaction makes me more committed and extreme, that looks like it's good from the point of view of democracy. I'm more likely to engage in protest activity. I'm more likely to donate. I'm a more active citizen. All of this sounds great, Talisse, right? Here's the reason why we really should be concerned, if you're not concerned about preserving civil relations with people with whom you disagree as a fundamental part of the democratic ethic. As we become more extreme in our contemptuous attitudes towards the other side, we also become more conformist with respect to people on our side. That is, like-minded political coalitions ultimately undermine themselves in the absence of healthy critical interactions with out-group members. Because the more and more we surround ourselves with like-minded others, the more homogeneous our groups become across factors other than our political commitments. Like-minded groups start dressing alike. They start pronouncing words in the same way. They start, and you could see why. Here's the reason why. You went to high school in the United States, you know how cliques work. Once we've identified an in-group and an out-group, and once we've seen that the in-group members have to be contemptuous of, distrustful of the out-group, policing the border between the in-group and the out-group becomes really important for the in-group. What does that mean? Our political coalitions become more homogeneous and they become more reliant on tastemakers and standard setters. They become more internally hierarchical. Think about the contemporary GOP now. More reliant on some single person who's going to say, here's what it takes to be a Republican. If you don't do this, you're a rhino. That's what we're seeing. It's just good social psychology predicts all of this under conditions of Bill Bishop style sorting. How's that?
No, it's great. And it's really helpful. So to get to that, and I'll start by answering my own question and then hear from you. What do we do about it? And by and I mean, including how do we be pro-democracy? How do we be Deweyites that believe that democratic ends require democratic means? How do we advance our sort of democracy-riven values while still avoiding, or let's set aside the word still, while avoiding unilateral disarmament to the detriment of democracy itself. So that's the project that I am noodling on. Even why I've considered changing the name of the podcast, because I don't merely want to consider democracy, I want to make sure it exists.
Good.
So I've got a few now, partial answers. One, talked about go after institutions. Got to still win. Can't be neutral. Got to work. Got to fight. Got to argue. Got to win. It's not enough to just be a team who thinks its only role is to, however you define that team. But as long as it's a pro-democracy team, it can't just think its role is to win less than half the time or half the time. It's got to try to win. Second, build pro-democracy decision-making structures that can sidestep some of our partisan disagreements. It's why I'm a sortition fan. It's why I'm a star voting fan, right? Like, it gets us out of just our partisan team building hats and towards our human, on the same side of the table, approaching common problems, figuring out how we're going to live together hats. A third one you sparked with what I heard you say, which I'm going to use my words, but I'm also attempting to feedback, which is avoid cultural arrogance, avoid cultural low-key tyranny. Ronald Reagan took a country club message and put it in a cowboy hat. World wrestling fans, PBR fans, that's professional bull riding for the uninitiated, country music fans, right? My wife is a big PBR fan and a big Red Dirt Country fan. And by the way, is frustrated enough about the current right wing that she doesn't want to talk to him anymore. She doesn't, like, if she met somebody, whatever, she's going to treat him like a human being, but driving her nuts. And I understand why. That we actually have to love thy neighbor. And by the way, if we love democracy, we at least, what I hear you saying and agree with, we at least need to respect the humanity of our neighbors. And by the way, if we don't, what I just heard you saying, the democracy itself will erode. And not because merely the pro-democracy people will be in charge, but the pro-democracy people will stop acting like pro-democracy people, and they themselves become more hierarchical. Is that fair, if not summation, at least some feedback?
Yes, that's good.
All right. It gets me then to this, okay, what about my spouse and I? What about guess who's coming to dinner? What about the MAGA relationship? And I'm, of course, outing my own policy preferences, but I'm never that secret about them. And that brings me to Brain Coach Brad. Because what Brain Coach Brad would say, and in fact has said, is that part of the challenge is not only that our mirror neurons reinforce our thoughts and we're with people with whom we agree. It's not only now when I go to, and by the way, when I go to professional bull riding now, it feels different than 10 years ago. It legitimately feels more culturally different. It feels more like a MAGA rally, right? Just cultural signals like, oh, wait a minute, it doesn't seem like they're talking to me. And I felt it, right? And people don't have to be fans of country music stars who've lost fans by criticizing George Bush, for instance, right, to understand those dynamics. We have sorted culture.
That's a real throwback, by the way, to the Dixie Chicks. Whoa.
Yeah. But not only limited to them.
Yeah.
So how do we treat one another? And it gets us to the guess who's coming to dinner. And it makes me think of Brain Coach Brad. And what he would say is, when we start, not only does our social proof, our desire to be in the in-group, reinforce our sense of the in-group. But even when somebody attacks our group, it doesn't get us out of the cult. It can reinforce our cult identity. It doesn't get us to rethink our predispositions. It gets us to reinforce them. And I've seen it happen. So he said, the first thing you have to do is the first thing you have to listen. So what do we do when we talk to people? Is first thing you do have to listen. And second thing you do, as hard as it has to be, is try to find some place of agreement, not to change your own mind, but to make sure at least that their mind doesn't get further dug in. To say, oh yeah, and find some areas at least of common humanity, at least like, yeah, but we both agree in democracy, right? Both think democracy is good, right? Like, just find some area. So that's what he would say is, first listen, make sure that there's some honoring of the person's humanity, some honoring of what they say, and then even some finding of some common ground, and then try to find either agreement or disagreement upon that basis. In fact, I've seen it happen the other way. I saw a guy who I would consider a friend, who the first time I talked to him said, and he happens to be a very wealthy guy and kind of a famous guy in my town. And when we talked politics, he said, oh, I don't like politics. And we didn't really talk further. And the only political thing I'd ever see him do was have his name and a quote listed on the website of an African-American candidate for judge who happened to be a Democrat, but is a nonpartisan judicial race. And that's the only times I'd seen him do politics. And then one day he posted on Facebook, Trump is a badass. And he said, he may have even said, I don't agree with him everything, but Trump is a badass. And by the way, and he said, I'm not that political. Like Bill Clinton was a badass, Barack Obama was a badass, but Hillary Clinton, she's no badass. And then he went and listed some other people who weren't badasses. And to his comments after that post, and I don't know what drove it or whatever, but it was, and came just a cavalcade, just a procession of how could you possibly think Trump is anything other than the devil? And I watched a guy become magnified in about 3 days, to the degree that when Mike Pence came and did a fundraiser here, he attended the fundraiser and made a significant donation. And I think it was one of the not very many political donations he'd ever made, that he became a political operative. Not because, and of course it was not merely, there were also people, of course, who would say, oh, thanks. And then all of a sudden he knew who his friends were and he knew who his enemies were. And that helped define further his identity, not only with whom he agreed, but who he disagreed. So Brain Coach Brad would say, yeah, because if you start just by saying you're an idiot, you have no humanity. If you don't think we owe the other side anything, then all you're going to be sure of is they stay the other side. So that doesn't have to mean you have to moderate your own viewpoint, but at least you have to tactically, if not morally, at least have conversations that make it possible that we can find agreement. Please respond.
Well, that sounds to me right. The way in which partisan reactions and these social dynamics that lead us to more extreme hot takes and more extreme commitments and more in-group consolidating behavior, not only are well documented, but they can happen very quick in certain kinds of contexts. And when you've got, a social media feed that is populated with a bunch of strangers, coming down on you who don't even know you, that could be a real clear incentive for you to circle the wagons around the people who seem to be supporting you and try to hold on to their support. So all this can happen very, very quickly. It's predictable given human social psychology. Let me sort of give one sort of story that that speaks to your anecdote here. And I collected some data on this that I'm trying to figure out exactly how to collate into real results. So bear with me. This is going to be anecdotal, but so remember 2 years ago, maybe when AOC wore the tax the rich gown to the Met Gala.
Yes.
And I've told people this and they claim that they have had similar experiences, but let me just tell you what I observed. On my social media feed, largely liberals, by the way, progressives even. There was commentary under the little, clip of her gown. Go AOC, what a cool thing, wonderful, tax the rich, we love it. A lot of support. It's cool. Second stage. Well, what are we talking about? Tax the rich. So the social media feed started to get into people who were posting not only supportive Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but sort of takes on what the slogan means. Very quickly, it became clear among the progressive posters that there were disagreements about what tax the rich means. Some people were posting, Jeff Bezos needs to pay his fair share. Other people were posting, criminalize being a billionaire. Some people were posting, destroy the tax system as we know it, burn down the banks, these kinds of things. I'm just observing. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Yeah, what does tax the rich mean? That there shouldn't be rich, or that they should be taxed until they're not rich, or what? I'm a Rawlsian about some of these things. I think that a progressive tax code is what justice demands, so on and so forth. Good. But here's the thing that I found really compelling and also predicted by some of the things that we've just been talking about. Once it became clear that there were disagreements about what the slogan meant, the conversation quickly devolved into accusations. if you think tax the rich simply means that Jeff Bezos should pay his fair share, congratulations, you're Ronald Reagan. It quickly devolved into who's with us and who's against us, who's authentically progressive and who's a poser. It quickly devolved into that clique high school behavior, where we're no longer committed to working together for a common purpose, even if we have different conceptions of the details. It instantly, almost instantly turned into, I'm the authentic. If you think that that Jeff Bezos shouldn't be in prison, you might as well be a Republican. That's what that taught. And note, what that suggests is, just as these dynamics predict, in-group behavior is really intolerant of disagreement among the in-group. That's part of the homogeneity. It seems to me to be disastrous for democracy. So,
yeah, and also not tactically helpful. Ultimately,
no, that's right. Good.
Ultimately,
Because what
then yields to even a policy set that is not majoritarian ain't going to win anyway.
That's right. And the coalition splinters. It factionalizes, right? Just it enacts that problem that we see in the Federalist Papers, right? Each person says, you're not with me exactly point by point, you're against me, and then eventually the coalition dissolves and nobody can accomplish anything democratically. It's ultimately counterproductive.
So my dad, when I was a small child, was the chief of staff to the Speaker of the House in my state, and he had that was not the only thing he did, but it taught him various things. And one of his lines was, in politics, there are no enemies, only adversaries. And even that idea, and a more modern line, which is not used sufficiently in politics, is something that effective organizations seem to adopt, is be hard on the problem, but soft on the people. And we have created, and you take that phrase, you take what one of the better organizational psychologists I know, when he comes in to do trainings for a nonprofit or a company, and he says, here are the things we got to do, the habits we've got to have. We got to be hard on the problem, soft on the people. That's how we got to learn to communicate, not say, oh, you're dumb and your idea is dumb, but instead say, hey, put that idea over to the side and then evaluate it based on its merits. And that habit, which is now, I think, consensus among anybody who looks at effective organizational behavior. When we take that organizational to a nation state, it is exactly, or at least close to exactly, the opposite of the thing you said, which is, hey, it's not that have a harder time on our agreeing or disagreeing about our problems. We have them, but not that much worse than the past, but we're much harder on the people. We have our identity much more closely aligned to the idea that we disagree with people.
So all that strikes me as right. Some positive steps that I think are important additions to what you laid out. Because, again, democracy is not sweetness and light, and there's no silver bullet either, right? I mean, it's sort of like there's not just one kind of thing or one sort of short list of things, and then we can mitigate some of these difficulties. I think that along with the kinds of more institutionally focused interventions, some of which you pointed to, along with some of the more group dynamical interventions of the kind that you see in these sort of democracy practice initiatives, sort of the Braver Angels, citizen juries, deliberative polling kinds of maneuvers. I'm on board with all of that. Let me just make that clear. I think that, in addition, part of what democracy is, and part of what I meant in calling it an ethos or an ethic, is that democracy is in part constituted by our own individual dispositions. I don't think that the solutions to these kinds of problems, partisan animosity, extremification, sorting, all of that stuff, I don't think that the solution lies strictly with political, institutional, group dynamical. I think that we need to work on ourselves as democratic citizens. It's very, very easy to diagnose the problems of intolerant coalitions, extreme coalitions, polarized coalitions when you're talking about the other guy's coalition, right? It's very easy to be a good diagnostician when you're talking about somebody else. But part of the challenge of being a moral agent, let alone a democratic citizen, is that moral defects are really easy to spot in others, and they're very hard to spot in ourselves. Vices are, the cowardly person doesn't think he's a coward. Right?
No, and I'll pile on, like set aside Dave Chappelle, but go into a social media. I was going to say chat room. That dates me, doesn't it? Go to a social media discussion, if it can be called that, and defend Dave Chappelle, or defend the somebody who says, well, I think there ought to be women's sports, and the level of discourse, and there will be thoughtful things that are said. And the thing I've said is, I don't consider myself to be an expert, and I think everybody should receive basic humanity and safety. But if one were to do that, one would pretty quickly get not merely disagreed with, but personally pretty closely attacked. And I could come up with any number. I mean, if somebody said, well, actually, I think we ought to have borders, right? Borders actually matter, which, by the way, almost everybody in America thinks, right? But if you come out and said, well, I think we should have borders, then that is not necessarily going to be a sort of an easy conversation, even though a significant percentage of the people in the coalition, majority of the coalition, think, well, of course. So it is not. So I agree. In the discourse, that is not. That ain't a one-sided problem. That's a human problem. How do we have a discourse that is a little less arrogant? How do we have a discourse that's a little more loving? How do we have a discourse a little more curious? How do we have a discourse that actually honors the humanity that we want to make sure our policy choices honor? That is without setting aside the really legitimate anger and the really legitimate passion around making sure that people are not discriminated against and harmed based on their sexuality or gender. How do we, or their decisions thereof? How do we, or their nature thereof? How do we make sure that someone who is new to the country is treated with respect? That we can think about those passionately, and what I hear you saying is make sure that we honor the humanity of everybody and respect democracy in that way. Small plug for, I ask everybody who uses the word to help us come up with another word other than polarization, because it I believe incorrectly makes us think of roughly symmetrical poles, which is not how I think the power dynamic has worked. It's not how I think it's accurate. And I wanted to say the thing I just said before I said this. I think it is accurate that that there is not only a sliver in someone else's eye, and at the same time, it ain't symmetrical stuff. So you end up coming up with another word. It's great. Any other to-dos, any other thing I got wrong, any other thing that we missed that we should have covered? We went a little over, but I'm glad we did.
Yeah.
Anything you want to cover before we bid ourselves goodbye?
Yeah, I want to make sure there are 2 points that we end on, at least that I want to make sure I say. So just to pick up on the sort of, we have to self-diagnose, and that's very, very difficult. Realizing that as much as we think that others are subject to these social dynamic forces that turn them into more extreme versions of themselves, overly hostile, so on and so forth, there's no reason to think that we are any less vulnerable. That's consistent with the phenomena being asymmetrical. Our vulnerability is symmetrical, though, because these are cognitive forces, right? And so, the difference between the stark raving guy on the other side and the more studied, Gentile civil guy on my side is not explicable in terms, not fully explicable in terms of what they believe. These are cognitive and social psychological dynamics in play, and our vulnerability to those dysfunctions is not symmetrically realized, but it is symmetrical in its vulnerability. That's a really, really important point, I think, that often gets lost. It's like, yeah, it's not because the MAGA guys are so stupid that they're subject to these forces. We're all subject to them. The story of how people become extreme extreme partisans and with all of the dysfunctions that connotes, is not fully a story of the badness of the things that they believe. It's in part a story about how human psychology works.
Well, I want to agree. I want to agree and push back. So I would agree if you had said it is not a unicameral problem. It is not a one-sided problem. It is a problem within every single human being, and therefore every coalition and set of human beings. I would agree strongly with that. I would stop short of saying symmetrical, because now we know that we can predict without perfection, but with alarming occasional accuracy, that the degree to which, likelihood to which, the sensitivity to which somebody has to the taste and smell of disgust overlaps with their politics. That being sort of ecumenical in thinking versus dogmatic in thinking is not the ambit of merely one political party, but a lot of this stuff is no longer, but it ain't evenly split. And I think that is so I guess that's what I'd say.
No, it's not evenly split. The vulnerability is evenly split, though. And we can see this because Republicans and Democrats don't extremify in any systematically different way when we're talking about like-minded groups that are not like-minded with respect to politics. So just to give these social cognitive dynamics that sometimes go under the name of polarization, which isn't the ideological distance between the parties, but has to do with forces that lead one to adopt more extreme attitudes and dispositions and beliefs. We've got lots of experiments that show, well, you get a group of like-minded people, all of whom agree that Lady Gaga is especially attractive. The longer they talk about how Lady Gaga is beautiful, I don't know if that's even a current example. It's Taylor Swift. I don't know, right? The longer they talk about the beauty of that person, the more beautiful they think she is, in a way that does not reflect or track partisan differences among the group members. You get a bunch of people together who are politically diverse, of different party affiliations even. They all agree that Denver, Colorado is especially notable for being high above sea level. The longer they talk about skiing in Denver, the higher above sea level they think Denver is, with no systematic difference that can be accounted for by partisan identity. So all I'm saying is not that that this is split down the middle. I'm not telling a both sides story. And I certainly don't think that the response to the problem, however it's defined, is to sort of invite your partisan enemies over for lunch and get to know them as people. I'll get to what I think the alternative story is in a second. I'm just saying that the vulnerability is a psychological and cognitive vulnerability. And it does not look as if, I know people tell stories that I think stretch beyond what the empirical data that they cite permit. People tell stories where they try to explain partisan identity in terms of deep-seated psychological differences. I think those stories are make for good popular best-selling books. I don't think that they're good social science. Different kind of story, though. So I
You think it's more social. You think about more social, more what we're surrounded by, what signals we get, and what gets reinforced and disagreed with. Yeah, and I don't. It's a nature nurture debate, and I don't think it's. And I would, for what it's worth, side more with you. And I still find the other psychological stuff, but there's still sort of a chicken egg issue with sort of the sort of deep seated psychological stuff. But rather than going further in that rabbit hole, let's finish with the thing you were about to offer about it's not just about inviting those with whom we disagree to dinner. I do like the idea of people going themselves to, sort of experience other sort of cultural experiences and try to get us more culturally mixed. But you were going to say something.
So I got sort of two thoughts. One thought is that I think that in this space, when we're thinking about prescriptions, about what to do, given all the divisiveness and animosity and all the rest, I think that the proposals that see part of the solution lying in better interactions among people who disagree, I think those solutions tend to overlook the different ways in which interactions among people who disagree can be structured. We're too fixated on the idea. Some of the citizen jury stuff, I think, is like this, that we get partisan foes together, they hear each other out, they listen first, They try to understand the other side, not because they're going to inch over to them, but they're going to try to understand where the other side's coming from so that they can recognize their civility, their humanity, extend to them basic dignity, all the rest. I'm on the side of all of that. I just think that it overlooks another, I think, complementary possibility. I think that a lot of political interactions, I think, let me put it this way. I have reason to think that we should expect very promising depolarization, de-escalation effects. If instead of getting both sides to hear each other out, pro-con, we sit down with our partisan foes and ask them, what's your best objection to my view? That's not inviting any of this sort of million, both sides have to sort of, give and take. I'm not entering the interaction with any thought of changing my mind even. I'm entering the interaction by saying, what's your best objection? Why don't I convince you? That is fully consistent with maintaining a super high level of confidence that I'm right. I think that's a good thing, because the price of entry into the interaction doesn't require that I adopt the million stance. Hey, for all I know, I could be wrong, right? It's like, no, I'm totally right. What's a mystery to me is why you don't believe me. What are the arguments? I want to hear. That could teach me something. That could teach me, maybe it's not obviously, my view is not obviously as correct as I thought it was. Maybe it'll teach me that. It could also teach me that, oh, I'm right. It's just that my view is prone to being misunderstood in certain ways, that I have to steelman my articulations of my view against those misunderstandings. I don't think that mode of political engagement has been explored in the way that as fully as it should be. I think that too much of it is aimed at the give and take pro and con stuff. That's one thing. Here's the second thing, and this is the more controversial thing that people, when I say, think this is nuts. I think that part of our sort of restoring democracy strategy, given the dysfunctions that we've laid out, part of the restoring democracy strategy has to be loosening, breaking, decentering the grip that our partisan selves have on us. That's not to say that we've got to get out of politics. It's to say that we have to recognize that our political environments are already sorted, are already saturated with the dynamics that lead interactions among like-minded people to extremify us, to make us more conformist, to make us worse at democracy, even if we're like-minded around the right policy views, right? So I think that part of restoring democracy involves building, because we can't just find them, we have to build venues, sites, forums where we can engage in pro-social cooperative behavior with people whose politics are entirely opaque to us. We have to find ways of interacting, cooperating with others whose politics we don't know anything about. We have to do cooperative things that help society along, where the activity itself is not an expression of our politics, not because we're suppressing our politics or bracketing our politics like at Thanksgiving dinners it sometimes occurs. We need to find things to do together where I don't know what your politics are because we're doing something else. The very fact, let me just say this to our listeners, the very fact that you are now thinking the thought, there is no such thing as a cooperative activity that's not already structured by partisan politics. The fact that you find that very proposal slightly illegible, I think, is a symptom of the centering of partisan identity and not a counterexample.
All right. Well, here's some of my takeaways. These are not paraphrases, to be clear. This is me talking. I will thank you again, but thank you for your insight and for the time you've spent. So what I would say is politically win. fight for democracy, institutionally dismantle and marginalize institutions and power centers that erode democracy and build those that maybe sidestep some of our differences. Culturally, don't be arrogant. As humans, respect the humanity of people. Democratically, use democratic means to achieve democratic ends. Recreationally, I use the word recreationally, it could be otherwise, find third spaces, right? Find a game group that didn't only vote for one political candidate necessarily. And personally, I really liked your question, what's your best objection to my view? Which I could ask you with respect to my list, if there was something in particular I missed. Otherwise, what I want to say is thank you so much for being with us. Robert Talisse, philosophy professor at Vanderbilt University, author of Sustaining Democracy, What We Owe the Other Side. Thanks for your time, Professor. Thanks for being a democracy nerd.
I appreciate that. I'm proud to be one.
Be well. This was great.
Thank you. Take care.
Cheers.